Do a morning routine for 7 minutes, do an email routine for 7 minutes, a social media routine for 7 minutes. Not because I want people to be more effective at email and social media, but because I think there's other things that we can spend our time on. Maybe we can be better husbands and wives. Maybe we can be better dads and moms. That's really what matters. I think if we can live with more purpose, live as Christians in a way where we are speaking into the lives of other people more often instead of using our phones so much, go ahead and be productive at work. Get everything done. Do a great job. Live with purpose when you're at work. But then just set it all aside and do things that matter more. Because productivity at the end of the day is really about being more effective at work. And then that allows you to be more effective as a human being.
Hey friends, welcome to the Word Made Digital podcast on YouTube. I'm the host, Joanna LaFleur, and this is season 8 of the podcast. Thanks for joining, for catching these episodes. We're leaning into hope and positivity for the future because it's been a rough couple of years. So enjoy this episode of the podcast. And hey, if you want to check out 7 seasons of archives of the podcast, as well as tutorials, practical help for you in church communications, creative, websites, social media, we got it all here on the YouTube channel. So subscribe now and enjoy this episode. John Brandon, welcome to Word Made Digital. I'm so glad to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, as a means of introduction, maybe we should start with who are you? Give us a little synopsis of your context.
Yeah, I have been a journalist for about a little over 20 years. I started out in 2001. Before that, I was a corporate manager, director type in the corporate world. So I have been amazingly productive as a journalist and author and writer for over 20 years. And it was just about a year and a half ago when I decided to write a book about all that productivity that I've done over the last 20 years. I like to say it was about 15,000 articles. I don't have an exact number, but it's pretty intense. I used to write 2 or 3 articles per day sometimes, or even more. I think my record is up there around maybe 8 or 10 articles in one day. So quite productive for a long period of time.
Wow. And I have it as 20 years and 18 million words that you've written. I mean, I don't even know how you estimate, how you go about. I mean, there is a way to do it, but how do you go about even calculating that? I mean, when you're at that
Yeah.
level of prolific writing, 18 million
Yeah.
words. um, so, I mean, again, this is a way to kind of, what kind of writing are you doing? Because I would imagine some kind of writing can be done quicker than others. Like if you're writing an opinion piece versus a scientific
Right.
research paper. These are very different kinds of work. So, what
Yeah.
kinds of work are you doing, or what kinds of publications are you writing for?
Yeah, and just to tell you the story of how this all started, I
Yeah.
was in the corporate world, and I was went through a corporate downsizing in 2001, a week after 9/11, so 9/18/2001.
Wow.
And I have a long history with marketing and communication, technical background. So I just decided to take all of that experience of being in the corporate world and just start applying it to my writing. So I started out, I used to review routers, not the wood making kind, but the Wi Fi kind. And I did that for a solid year, just writing about routers and reviewing them. Made a pretty good living doing that for magazines. I don't know if you remember what magazines are, but
Those shiny things that sit in people's
yeah,
bathrooms. Yeah.
it's the part of Barnes and Noble, the bookstore, that's no one's ever standing around, and no one's ever looking at magazines anymore, sadly. But I did a lot of online writing and I did some business writing. But my career really took off in about 2004 I started writing for Fox News, and I did a weekly column for foxnews.com.
Huh.
And that was typically about technology, like how to keep your kids safe online, or are video games bad for you or not? I tend to think they're bad for you. So uh, then I started to uh, get into more of the business writing field. So I
Mm.
started writing a column for Inc. magazine, a really well-known business magazine.
Yeah.
And I did a column in print for 3 years. And then I started a column, and I did that for about 7 years online. And I wrote 2 or 3 columns per day. The total was around 4,000 columns during a 10-year period
Wow.
for Inc. magazine. And I currently write for Forbes. So that's my main online column right now.
Well,
So,
before we go into the productivity thing, because the conversation here on Word Made Digital is often in this realm of how digital has affected everything about sort of how we live our lives. I say it's not everything we do is digital, but it's the water that we swim in. But you're literally talking about being a writer in this transition from print to digital. So, before we go into the productivity thing, I just love your take on that side of things as a writer or as a professional in this industry. Um, Say more about this idea of like the death of the magazine, or maybe if you want to go on a rant about video games, I'd love to hear more about that.
yeah, I actually have a view that I prefer magazines. I like to hold something in my hand. Maybe that's makes me a little old fashioned. But the digital realm tends to be um, it's a representation of something. It's bits and bytes.
Hmm.
So I'm very happy with the fact that when I first started out, online sites were not as common. We didn't talk about clickbait and lead generation and content marketing and all those terms that we know now. Back then, it had to be published in a magazine. That online still existed in 2001. It had barely started, but it
Hmm.
just wasn't as common. I actually remember the transition from Inc. magazine in print to becoming an online portal. And I was part of that transition. I was even an editor for a while for Inc. magazine online.
Hmm.
And then, most people would say that they're probably familiar with Forbes and Inc. and Popular Mechanics and some of these other outlets for what they do online more than what they do in print. But I have to say that, and we can talk about this later, but in terms of the world of distraction and clickbait and trying to get our attention, the attention economy, it's called. I prefer the good old days when it was just a magazine that you sat with on the couch and
Hmm.
read. And I think there's something about that tangible physical object that you're holding. It's the same reason that whenever I buy an ebook, I barely read it, but when I pay $40 to buy an actual book, I usually tend to read it, and it's a physical object that I'm consuming. And so that gets into my philosophy of digital. I prefer physical objects and tangible things to the digital realm.
Hmm. And John, when you talk about that as a philosophy, do you see others joining you? What I mean is, do you feel like you're alone in this, or do you? So, in many ways, digital is so new, but yet we're starting, I think, in some pockets to see the rise of the. I mean, certainly, social media is criticized. There's real
Right.
concern about what Facebook or the Meta group of apps is doing to the brain, or to especially to young people. Do you see in the industry, do you see a move where people are choosing to go back to print? Are people subscribing to
Yeah.
printed things again, or what do you notice? What do you
Yeah.
you know? Is there a pendulum swing the other way? What are you noticing?
Yeah. I would love to lead a revolution to go back to physical objects and
Hmm.
tangible things in life. And, I'm a big advocate of journaling. I have a 7-minute journaling routine in my book. And I just feel like when you're sitting there in a physical space and you have a physical journal with this thing called a pen. I don't know if you've heard of that
I've
before.
heard of an
And you,
Apple Pencil, but tell me more about this pen that you
yeah,
speak of.
yeah, it has ink in it, and you write on a piece of paper, a
Yeah.
physical piece of paper. I have to say that when I talk about these things, people say that's old fashioned, get with the program. The digital age has been here for decades. And I just would like to say that, here's a quick example. This is one of my favorite stories. When I was playing video games with my son once, we were in the basement and we had this game called Forza. And it allows you to go on a racetrack anywhere you want in the world, and it just seems so awesome, right? And we're sitting there playing the game, and I happen to test cars for a living as well. I've gotten a different car in every week for the last 10 years. And I just happen to have a Corvette in the garage of my house.
Hmm.
And we were in the game, and we were playing the game with a Corvette in the game. And I remember looking at my son and saying, why are we even doing this? Why are we playing this game when there's a real Corvette in the garage?
Yeah.
And so the two of us, we went upstairs and we got in the Corvette and we drove it around for a couple of hours. And I just remember thinking, not to spiritualize this too much, but things that are real and tangible and that you can
Hmm.
hold in your hands, they tend to have a lot more value than something that's just pixels on a screen somewhere. And I guess if I were to say anything to the listeners today, it's not old fashioned to go back to the physical objects of the world. Are you spending time with real people? Are you in the physical space that you're in? Are you experiencing whatever it is that God wants you to experience in the moment? Or are you living in a virtual world where everything is fleeting and superfluous and isn't going to last? It's ephemeral. And, those are the types of things that don't give you meaning and purpose in life. So go back to the basics, and you will find a whole new level of fulfillment and joy in the physical world.
Hmm. Well, I think that leads me into the conversation about routines in general, or habits, routines. Maybe in my mind, those are different things, but maybe for you, they are quite similar. I'd love to talk about routines. The world. Uh, I'm talking to you from a hotel room in Amsterdam. I'm completely out of routine. I'm in a random place. My schedule's off. My time zones are off. But through the power of digital tech, we're talking to each other today. But I struggle finding routine, and yet I think there's something in all of us that knows, like, we give it to children because routine is good for children's mental health. But
Right.
talk to us about routine. Why do we need them? The world is unpredictable. Like,
Yeah.
is it even practical to think about doing routines anymore? I'd love to dive into that a bit.
Yeah. I view routines as one of those things that allows us to focus on what really matters. So if you think of it like, driving a car, you don't have to think about the routine of the gas pedal and the brake, hopefully, unless you're just new to driving. But for someone like me, I never have to think about that routine. I also tend to park in the same spot at the mall, and I park at the same spot at work. And I think I do that because I just don't think those things matter that much. And
Hmm.
so what I'm trying to do is set a habit and a routine. Another one is brushing your teeth. Like if we had to think about that every day, um, it just wouldn't really lead to a healthy lifestyle because we'd have to put too much brain power toward it. So if we can take things that are repeatable, like checking email or writing in a journal or doing social media, whatever it is, if somehow those things can become routine and controlled and measurable, then we have a whole bunch of other time where we can do things like building relationships with other people, or maybe improving our relationship with God, or reading the Bible in a way that isn't just really quick and fast. We can become much more. We can experience more depth in the physical realm of life and with relationships when we take some of these repeatable things that aren't really that important and make them more habitual as part of our lives.
Okay, so tell us a little bit more about this research you've done, because I know in writing 7 Minute Productivity Solution, you did some work on habits. What are some things about habits that are interesting to you, or maybe some things that people may not know about how habits are part of
Yeah.
us?
Yeah, and one of the things I would say about my book is that it was born out of my own experience of being distracted.
Hmm.
And so, one of the things that I've struggled with for years and years, ever since email was invented, is I get sucked into this time warp of checking email. And I don't know if people can relate to this, but you sit down and you think, okay, I'm just going to check email for a few minutes.
Yeah.
And then pretty soon it becomes a half an hour. And then I did see some studies on this. Two different independent studies found that we spend as much as 30 hours per week in our workday, in our work week, checking email. And I'm thinking, I don't know what we're doing for those other 10 hours, but it must be really productive because the
See,
30
30
hours of
hours. Yeah.
email just seems like a lot to me,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, it's sort of
So,
it
so
it
the,
becomes the hamster wheel. That's the image I have when you say 30 hours of email. It's just we're running on this thing that we'll never get ahead of it. There's
yeah,
always another email.
yeah, it's almost like a treadmill that's leading us nowhere, and it doesn't mean we have purpose and meaning in it, but we feel like we're getting somewhere, right? We're
Mm.
going through the motions of running or doing walking or exercising. Uh, I just view some of these things. They're important. Email is important. It's not like I'm going to say don't check email, don't go on social media. The reality is we do need these tools, and they are effective and important. My problem is that we overuse them. We spend way too much time on email, way too much time doom scrolling on Instagram. And then what I worry about sometimes is that if we're spending all this time in the digital space and we're doing all these things that we think matter, like let's say Instagram, what are we missing out on? What are all the things that we could be productive about in our lives and in our workplace? And I don't even think we know. I think we're so distracted and so spending so much time with these apps that we're really missing out on the important things in life.
Hmm. Well, it makes me think about, when you're talking about routines and habits, and then coupling that with things like these digital tools, or what do you call it? The doom scroll on Instagram. I think, uh, growing up, a child is taught about, you've talked about the routine of brushing your teeth. There are these things you're taught and trained in, whether at home or in school, to kind of become like a fully functioning adult. You got to learn how to brush your teeth.
Right.
um, but I think, just in reflection, I'm a millennial, so I'm coming up in this digital world. No one taught me how to do email, or rather how
Mhm.
to integrate it into my day, week schedule. There was just no habit training on these things, like the mindless scrolling that everybody does. It's sort of
Mhm.
like the lowest common denominator, because it's like not that I blame an education system. I mean, it's constantly trying to keep up with technology that's changing every year. But none of us have really been trained in it, and now we're all expected to know how to have a healthy relationship with it. I guess that's what I'm
Right.
trying to get at.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring that up because, Facebook does not tell you how to use Facebook. And
Yes.
there's a reason for that.
Hmm.
This is the definition I've heard of addiction and obsession is that it's something that you're pursuing that is never quite within reach. And so that's why you keep pursuing it. And that's really what Facebook has done. They don't do training videos on how to use Facebook effectively because it's designed to keep you using it. The more you use it, the more ads you see and the more money Facebook makes. So honestly, if there was a training session about email and Facebook and Instagram and all these other digital tools, we might start using them effectively, and then
Hmm.
they might not make as much money. One of my favorite things about Facebook that people don't even know is there's a way to save and mark posts in Facebook and read them later. It's
Yes.
a feature in Facebook. It's amazing how many people don't even know that that's available. They think they
Mm,
have to keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling.
right.
But I guess I'm here to say there is a way to use these apps more effectively. And when you do, it frees up a ton of time for things that matter more in your life.
Before we go into some of that practical stuff, there's this other thing that you describe, and I think this is from James Clear, the hyperactive hive mind, but you call it the hyperactive hive mind of online obsession. Can we talk about that for a
Yeah.
minute? I love that.
That's
That
a
phrase
com
is an amazing mouthful. The hyperactive hive mind of online obsession.
Yeah. A lot of the productivity experts talk about that. Cal Newport is another pretty
That's who.
famous
Maybe that's who it
guy.
is. Yeah.
Yeah, and he talks about it, and then it's pretty common. James Clear has talked about it. What they're really talking about is that this always on mentality, that you have to be aware of, the latest news reports and the latest Facebook changes and the settings that you need to do. And is your phone lasting long enough? Are you managing your battery properly? And what it means is that we have to be in a constant state of education, a
Hmm.
constant state of awareness. And I just don't think God created us to be in that state, to
Hmm.
be always on, always thinking, always taking in information. And what it's really created in society today is everyone is really stressed out
Right.
because we always have to be thinking and processing. We don't have enough downtime. We don't get away from these apps often enough.
Um. So you as the 20-year, 18 million word writer have had to develop some habits. And you talk about how this shift particularly happened for you when you went full-time journalist, from your
Yeah.
previous career. So before we go into what those changes are and how other people can, I'd love to hear a little bit more of your own story with that. Like, why did you make the change? Were you forced? Were you failing as a journalist and your butt was getting kicked every day? You needed to, like, usually we don't change until we have to. So what caused the
Yeah.
change for you?
And just so you know, the book came out of an Inc.com column
Huh.
called The 7 Minute Morning Routine.
Okay.
And that particular article went viral in about 2015. 400,000 people read it. A lot of people started doing that routine. But that article came out of something that I did back in about 2001, 2002. I started writing in a journal every single day.
Hmm.
And the reason I did that is because I had to. The first
Hmm.
6 months that I was working as a journalist, I had four little kids at home. We were in a little bit of a panic as far as house payment and even food. When I was downsized, it was a pretty major event. I was making around 100,000 a year, and led a team of 50 people. And I still remember to this day being walked to the door by my boss, and he's like, "I'm really sorry we had to do this to you. Can I have your badge?" And that was the last time I ever saw him. Well,
Hmm.
that first 6 months, I had to collect my thoughts. I had to stay on task because if I didn't, little kids would not be fed, literally, type of
Right.
thing.
Wow.
And so I started a morning journal. And here's the crazy thing about my book is that the reason why I picked that 7 minute time period is because I realized that's how long I was doing a morning journal. And then I
Hmm.
also realized that's how long I was checking my email. When I was really effective at email, that's how long I would do it. And then I would go on to other things. I also found out my daughter, she's actually a missionary in Austria, and she's now 32 years old. But when she was helping me with some of the research and doing some of the editing for the book, she said that, Dad, I remember when you were writing, in those early days, you used to take a break and you used to come up and talk to us about school, and I feel like it was about 7 minutes. And I'm
Hmm.
like, yeah, you're probably right. That's how long I took a break, about 7 minutes. It turns out that time period is actually how long our brains can focus on something. It's called sustained attention span. And we can focus on something for 7 minutes. They've done studies on this in the classroom. Radio talent and podcasters like yourself, you maybe even know this, that after 7 minutes you can start losing an audience, and you need to take a break or a commercial. So I just discovered this organically, that's how long it takes to do a 7-minute morning routine. That's how long it takes to check your email effectively. And then I decided to write a whole book about that.
Okay, so we got to talk about the morning routine. Can you break it down for us? This
Yeah.
7-minute thing.
Yeah. So if someone wanted to do this, I would say, first of all, buy the book. I mean
Yes.
that facetiously, but that's where I document all of
Yeah.
it. But just the rough idea, I recommend getting a kitchen timer, very low tech. They sell them at Amazon for about $5. You just click a button and it counts down from 7 minutes. But what you do is you have to prepare yourself for your time, your 7-minute time. So you take a minute just to prepare. In the routine, there's another minute where you just write down the things that you're thinking about for the day, not your tasks, not the things that you're going to accomplish for the day, but just what are you processing? What are you thinking about for the day? What's facing you? You do that for a minute. There's something that I invented for the morning routine, and it's called hope moments. And those are the things that you're really looking forward to the most. You take a minute and you write down your hope moments. One example is when my youngest daughter got married, she did her morning routine and wrote down in a journal. And one day, it was about a year ago, she wrote down that her hope moment for that day was, I'm going to get married. So that was her hope moment for the day.
So
And
even, you
then
mean
there's
even on her
another,
wedding day? You're saying on her wedding day she was doing the routine?
yes,
Yeah, that's
yep,
awesome.
yep. Yeah, and once you get into the habit of doing a journal, it just becomes part of what you do. It's part of who you are as a person. Um, so that's for a minute. You write down your hope moments, and then there's another minute in the routine where you write down your stressors for the day, things that are irritating you, that you're thinking about, that are like causing you to think negative thoughts. From a science standpoint, negative thoughts are easier to think than positive thoughts. And I can explain why that is later if you want. But negative thoughts tend to rule in your brain. So you write those down for 1 minute and then you cross them off. You cross off all the stressors. That physical act with a physical pen and a physical
You literally
journal.
put like a line through them. Is that what you mean?
Yep. Put a line through those stressors. And there's something about that act of saying, this isn't going to be what I think about today. This isn't going to rule my day. The hope moments and the things that I'm really looking forward to. Part of the routine is looking back at your journal and saying, here's what I'm going to review. Here's the things that matter to me. Here's what I'm thinking about. Here's my hope moments. And then here's the stressors that I'm not going to be thinking about for the day. And then there's just a wrap up period. Honestly, it's meant to be really simple and easy. It's not supposed to be rocket science because most of us aren't rocket scientists. It's meant to be something that you can do every single day, and it's no big deal, but it sets the tone of you're going to be more habitual and routine in your thought process. And then maybe you'll be that habitual and routine about all the other things that you're facing for the day.
And so you find this not as just like a mindfulness exercise, but what's the connection, I guess, to productivity? Because you're not making a to-do list.
Right?
Why is this a
Mhm.
productivity solution?
Yep, that's a great question. And I'm glad you brought up the word mindfulness because I actually don't like that word very much. And I can
Okay.
explain why.
Yeah.
But the reason why, so spending 7 minutes doing something with intention, it teaches you to pay attention to the time. It teaches you how to be a good time management person. And then what happens is, so you spend that 7 minutes in your morning routine, and then in other areas of life, you become much more intentional as well. I will say that when I forget to do that morning routine, and there's other things that I do during the day, like I have a 7 minute break that I take every day, sometimes multiple times per day. But the one that really hinges on is that morning routine. When I don't do that, my day doesn't go the same way. I
Mm.
tend to get too distracted, and I'm not really paying attention to time as much. Another really interesting thing about my morning routine is I always start with my devotional time, and
Oh, you
that's
do
right
that
when I wake up
before.
in the morning.
You do
I
that
do my
before this
devotional
list.
time first.
Mm.
Yep. And that's because, well, I have to say the first thing is coffee. So I start with coffee.
Yeah.
And then I do my devotions. And that devotional time, I don't time that. I spend time with God. God is above time, He's not restricted by time. So I can spend 45 minutes, usually with a YouVersion Bible app, and I'll play it, the audio version of that. But I'll spend a half an hour, 45 minutes doing that. And that's just time with God. Uh, and then when I'm done with that, when I'm ready to start my work day, before I do any work, I always do a 7 minute morning routine. And that just sets the tone of productivity for the rest of the day.
Mm. Um, and mindfulness that you said you were going to say more about why you don't like the word.
Yeah, I just have this view of mindfulness. What people really mean is that, I'm going to be maybe reflect on things, but there's this sort of I would call it a new age mentality.
Mm.
Sometimes you've probably heard this before, but when we talk about things like I'm going to clear my mind, what
Yeah.
I think that does is it actually opens us up to negative thoughts and maybe things that are destructive. I view the term mindfulness and clearing your mind is actually a little more dangerous because I don't think it teaches us to ward off distraction. I think it opens us up to attacks or
Mm.
negative thoughts or spiraling downward into things. The whole field of mindfulness, I don't think they've provided very good tools of productivity. They've just told us just sit in the corner and think about good thoughts, or clear your mind, or
Yeah.
and I also tend to I tend to think of it as something that's more of a religion. And so I just don't really subscribe to the whole mindfulness
Mm.
thought pattern.
Well, and
So
you also alluded to this idea that negative thoughts are easier or more natural to us than positive. Can you say more about that?
right. Yeah, and I guess I should just say one other thing about mindfulness is that it isn't effective against distraction because distractions are getting worse. And so what's happening is that there's more and more apps, there's more shows on Netflix, there's more things to play, video games on our phone and Xbox. And so mindfulness is not an effective tool to ward off those distractions.
Hmm.
Um, in terms of the negative thoughts, so I'm going to do a little brain science with you right now, and so I apologize in advance for that. But the way things work in our brain, and I don't claim to be a brain scientist. I've just studied this a lot over the last 20 years or so.
Mm.
But in your brain, there's something called dopamine. And when dopamine is a reward system in your brain, when you experience something positive, you get just a little bit of dopamine. And that's a good thing, unless, it turns into a bad thing if your good thing is that you finished writing an email or you effectively scrolled through Instagram for an hour. You get a dopamine hit. You also get a dopamine hit in your brain when you finish a marathon. So, back to our earlier conversation about the physical realm versus the physical realm is much more valid in terms of that dopamine. Um, but that dopamine is not very prevalent in your brain. There's something called cortisol that's more prevalent in your brain. That's where it gets into the flight or fight mechanism in your brain, and we're always in a defensive posture. Like, is someone going to attack me or run into
Yeah.
me on the road, and how am I going to react? It's that old thing about a hot stove. We seem to be wired as humans to be well aware of the hot stove and what we should do about that when we touch it. We should flinch back, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so scientists have been saying this for a long time, that negative thoughts flow more freely in your brain because we just seem to be wired for that flight or fight mechanism. And then we have to actually work harder to experience happiness and to experience joy. This gets into my views as a Christian that, sometimes we have to choose joy. We have to choose happiness because that we have to work harder at that. And then if we just give in to depression and anger and negative thoughts, that's easier in a way that's more human. And so if anyone's listening to this and they fight with these topics and they feel like, there's depression or anger going on in your life, sometimes you just have to choose to be joyful and choose to be happy
Mm,
because your brain is fighting against you and it's trying to get you to think negative thoughts, but you have to work harder to avoid that.
mm. When we yeah, when we talk about this idea of sustained attention spans, as you've said, uh there's more against us now than ever. Do you feel that? Do you feel that in your reader, the publications you're working with? I'm thinking about, like, do you have pressure from I don't know, whoever is your editor? Has it changed how you're writing or changed the kinds of articles people are reading and sharing?
It's changed the field of journalism quite a bit because there's this idea that, we could talk about a very timely topic, the slap. I'm sure you know about the slap.
This is
Uh,
the Will Smith slap at the Oscars at the time of
yeah.
our recording here. Yeah.
So there's this
Yeah.
this pressure. It doesn't come from my editors, actually. I'm at the stage of my career where I tend to pick my own topics. I write my own columns. I'm very autonomous in that regard. And I have been for a really long time, for about 10 or 12 years now. But there's a pressure from the readership and from, is the article going to be successful? Is it going to get traffic? So if I'm thinking about what am I going to write about today, I have to cut through all of that distraction and all that noise. And if I write about something like the slap, then I'm going to cut through that noise more
Huh.
effectively, and more people are going to read the article. But the question is, should I even bother writing about that?
Yeah.
Because honestly, everyone else is too. Um, I prefer to write about things like mentoring or speaking into the lives of others or effective servant leadership. Those are topics that I'd love to do more of a deep dive on. And I have in my Forbes column, I've written about those things many times. But you have to resist this idea. And once again, it's because it's negative. That slap, that was a negative thing. And our brains are wired to be attracted and drawn to those things. When we say clickbait, the classic example of clickbait is read this article and you won't die. That's the most
Yeah.
effective clickbait
Yeah.
headline ever.
Yeah.
Um, but if I write about, how to be a better servant leader or how to mentor other people, it might not get the same traffic, but it certainly has more depth to it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think it's that tension of anyone who's a communicator, and there's lots of those listening to this podcast. Um, you know, Even Jesus, when is he addressing an issue of the day, talking about something specifically, whether that's because someone asked a question or because it's, a trendy thing that people are concerned about, or when are we talking about more timeless, or maybe not even just timeless, but just things that we are personally compelled to do our work about.
Right.
And I think, the how many pastors are going to feel the pressure to as you say, the slap, because it's the week that it's happened in the news. How many people are going to, how many pastors are feeling the pressure of alluding to it or mentioning it in their sermons, posting a comment online. I see so many, Christian leaders on social media who say, okay, we got to talk about this. I'm like, and then I just immediately think, do we have
Right.
to talk about it? Do we
Hmm.
have to have our voice in everything that is
Right.
happening in the world?
Yeah. And so the irony with this that I have to say is I probably will write about it, and I'll
Hmm.
send you the link and maybe you can include it with
Yeah,
this
that'd be great.
podcast.
I'd love to see.
But the angle that I'm going to take is, why are we so obsessed with the slap? Like, why
Huh.
are so many social media users talking about this?
Yeah.
And again, it's because we're trying to cut through the distraction. C.S. Lewis said there will only be noise in hell. And I think we're
Mm.
almost living in this age where all there is noise, and all there is social media and tweets and Instagram posts. And how could we ever keep up with any of that? For anyone listening to this, if you're addicted to these apps and you're just constantly doom scrolling, here's my tip for you for the day. Try take your phone, and next time you're in the car and you arrive at your
Drive
destination,
over the phone. No, I'm just kidding.
uh, put your phone in the trunk of your car.
Hmm.
That's my tip for the day. And close the trunk and walk away, and just don't use the phone, and just see how that goes for a few hours. Honestly, people, 100 years ago, they didn't have cell phones, and they got along just fine. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think my last question, I guess, for you here is, why does, and in some ways it's a rhetorical question, but I'd love to hear from you. Why does this matter? Or maybe another way of putting that is, what is at stake here? Like, why does this productivity conversation
mhm.
matter to you or matter to all of us?
Yeah, great question. And I feel like the right answer to that question is, some people would say we want to be productive so that we can accomplish more, right? So that we can become better people, or we can build bigger companies.
Mm.
I actually have achieved a lot of success in my career as a columnist and writer. I added up the total audience once of my articles, and I arrived at about 60 million people have read my columns over the last 20 years.
Wow.
But I'm going to surprise you a little bit and say that I think the main reason to be productive at work is that so that we can invest in other things that matter even more than work.
Hmm.
So that's why I wrote the book. That's why I think we should do a morning routine for 7 minutes, do an email routine for 7 minutes, a social media routine for 7 minutes. Not because I want people to be more effective at email and social media, but because I think there's other things that we can spend our time on. Maybe we can be better husbands and wives. Maybe we can be better dads and moms. That's really what matters. I think if we can live with more purpose, live as Christians in a way where we are speaking into the lives of other people
Hmm.
more often instead of using our phones so much, go ahead and be productive at work. Get everything done. Do a great job. Live with purpose when you're at work, but then just set it all aside and do things that matter more.
Hmm.
Because productivity at the end of the day is really about being more effective at work. And then that allows you to be more effective as a human being.
Yeah. John, I love it. I feel encouraged and challenged by your thinking on these topics. Where do you want to send people today on the internet to find your
Yeah,
book, to find your work?
yeah,
What should we
yeah.
link to people to?
Yeah, after all this discussion about avoiding the digital temptation and the distractions,
Yeah.
yeah, it's 7minutesolution.com is my website. Please go try to find a bookstore though where there's a physical book that you can hold in your hands. That's my favorite thing to do. Barnes and Noble carries the book. But yeah, 7minutesolution.com is where you can connect with me.
Okay. Uh, John, thank you so much. Great to have you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.